and innovative thinkers of my generation, and is really doing a lot to enliven and renovate Marxism. So the chapter in this book that I wrote is about the state, and what I argue in this chapter is that the state is an environment-making institution. This is very much beholden to Jason's work, and part of the argument at a sort of a basic political level is to say, look, this new role that government has to take on if we are to confront the climate crisis and the ecological crisis in general, be that in the form of reform politics or in the form of socialism. I mean, what would socialism look like? It would look like a very robust state. And even interim reforms have to involve a renovation of the state and its reimposition of power over capital on the economy. So part of my argument is that this is actually not a new role, that this is actually inherent to what the capitalist state does, for better and for worse. And that the question is not to get the state to be an environment-making institution, but to recognize that it is and to change the nature of its environment-making. So how is the state an environment-making institution? Well, I begin by entering into the question of value theory, right? And taking up where Jason mentioned about Marx's quote in the Gotha program about how labor is not the only source of wealth, nature is just as much a source of use values as labor, and is surely use values that constitute economic wealth. Okay, so nature is a source of value just like labor. Well, where is nature, right? On the surface of the earth, in the form of trees, animals, waterfalls. He has a famous passage about the power of waterfalls, kind of the rents captured from waterfalls, sort of locational advantage, which Jason fits into Jason's notions of sort of like the four cheaps, which are central to his book Capitalism and the Web of Life. So okay, so nature is on the surface of the earth. Well, what is it that delivers quote-unquote nature, because I'm very much in line with this effort to abolish the nature-society distinction, but for the moment, like, let's just say, so where are the use values, the utilities, the useful qualities of biophysical reality? They're on the surface of the earth. What institutions in the modern era control the surface of the earth? States, right? States not only have geography, they are geography, right? They're fundamentally defined by the bounding of territory. State power happens geographically. Political power doesn't necessarily, right? There's empires that take the form historically of networks, etc. But the modern state is very much a geographically bounded entity. So then the question is looking at, well, how does the state, through its ultimate control of territory through violence, crystallized as legal regimes, how does it deliver these use values to production, like the strength of wood that capital needs as a use value to process through production to turn into a table which is sold for exchange values, for the social power that is money, that can be anything, right? How does capital get that? How does one capitalist get those trees and not another capitalist? Through property regimes which are enforced by states. Some people have the right to these trees and cut them down and process, and others don't. And the ultimate arbiter of that in a situation that's not a failed state and an outlaw situation is government, is the state. So that's the basic entry point to realize, like, wait a minute, okay, so the state, because it is geographic, is also inherently environmental, and all of its policies, in that they relate to how social relations unfold across space, are inherently environmental. More specifically, states, if you get into their specific histories, are all about actually transforming landscapes so as to facilitate and conjure forth the forces of capitalism. And so the rest of the essay is a description of how capitalism was born in America, essentially, how it was midwifed, or how it was banged out politically with violence and law by the state. And in particular by Alexander Hamilton, who is the sort of the mastermind of the hidden developmentalist state in America. And he writes this report in 1791, the Report on Manufactures, which no one reads even now in the Hamiltonian moment, and no one reads it because I can't stand musicals, but whatever. Maybe it's in there, but from what I've heard, it's not in there. Why does no one read it? Because they love Hamilton when he's talking about finance and banks, but because it opens with an attack on Adam Smith. It opens with a repudiation of laissez-faire economics, and then proceeds to articulate a post-colonial defensive strategy. And Hamilton's vision is fundamentally, it's militaristic and nationalist. He's like, we will be dominated economically and then militarily if we do not develop a wealthy economy that funds a military force that can stand up to the core, right? We're the periphery, Britain is the core, they're coming to get us again. And we must have the wealth to fight them. And the only way we can do that is through developing manufacturing and manufacturers, as he said, right? Industrialization, they didn't use that word. And they didn't use the word capitalism. And he says, Adam Smith, he doesn't name Adam Smith, it's just like, this theory, he name checks it, he quotes Adam Smith, is like, this is not going to work, it's not true. Manufacturing doesn't just happen on its own. It has to be driven. It has to be nurtured by the state. And then he lays out this whole agenda of what he calls the means proper, about how the state should do this. And this is, in fact, how capitalism has developed everywhere that it has developed. And that text is really the first comprehensive description of these means. So how does the state do that? This agenda is also highly contested up to this day, as we can see. So the first way the American government does this is through its use of land. It uses its control over territory as collateral to borrow against internationally and to distribute as subsidy to nascent firms, nascent sort of class formations that emerge and develop into capitalist forces of production. And the example I use mostly in this essay is the Erie Canal, because long story short, sort of the Hamiltonian vision is defeated and sort of progresses at the state level. So how was the Erie Canal built? It was built by large gifts of federal land and water to the state of New York, and then the state of New York would then use these, and this establishes a pattern for development of railroads and also a whole kind of pattern for public contracting that we still use today in many ways, whereby the state parceled out in alternate plots to private interests land that these contractors could then borrow against themselves and sell, raise money to then dig the canal. The canal is built essentially with this massive subsidies of cheap nature, right? Delivered not by just something or gathered up, delivered by the state and its violent legal control over territory. That then transforms New York, and it helps open what was called the Old Northwest, and really starts launching the Industrial Revolution in the United States. So that's the historical story, and part of the subtext and punchline in this essay was all about how to deal with climate change. And the argument is essentially that we have to acknowledge that the state is this environment-making institution, that it's doing the very same thing with fossil fuels, right? The fossil fuel industry is massively subsidized. And so the choice is not like, should the state essentially direct the economy or not? The choice is, how will the state direct the economy? Will it direct it over the cliff by continuing to subsidize fossil fuels? Or will it rescind those subsidies and subsidize a clean technology revolution, a clean energy revolution? And in that regard, this election is pretty, in some ways depressing, but in other ways, I don't know. It's actually, there's some openings, but it's going to be a terrible 4 years, no doubt. But the argument around that is, and now I think I'm sort of leading the train of the essay into just larger thoughts that relate to these questions, is that if the capitalist state, globally, in America, wherever, were to use its power to euthanize the fossil fuel industry and drive a clean technology revolution, which it could do, that would not be the same as creating a sustainable society. It would merely be to, at the last minute, avoid the edge of the cliff and buy time to deal with the more fundamental question, which is, the unsustainable nature of an economic system that has to grow infinitely on a planet that is finite. So that's the essence of the argument, which is that, if value is partially produced by biophysical reality other than human labor power, where is that? It's on the surface of the earth. What does that mean in the modern era? It means that the state is the key arbiter. It is the broker. It is the umpire in terms of who gets access to nature or biophysical reality, the web of life. And this goes on whether we acknowledge it or not. And part of the political choice we have to make is to see this, and we have to incorporate into our arguments the fact that this is not a proposal. This is a fait accompli. This already happens. This is how the thing works. And the question is not should the state, but how should the state do this? So I don't want to talk too long because there's a lot of people here, and I'm sure there's a lot of interesting questions. So those are my thoughts on this.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to pose a couple of questions and encourage Jason and Christian to kind of dialogue or discuss amongst themselves a little bit some further thoughts and amplifications. And then in about 15, 20 minutes, we'll turn it over for your questions and comments. But first, I wonder if Jason could just maybe very quickly run down the rest of the book and the other contributors and how the whole thing kind of comes together or fits. Let's not miss anybody.
The book is an ongoing conversation. Is eclectic. We have a wonderful kind of spoken word essay by Donna Haraway, a great feminist theorist, who talks. Are we okay there? All right. Sorry about that. There. Who talks about this Anthropocene, Capitalocene, and then her utopistics. And then her Capitalocene, which is her utopistics for thinking about a world beyond capitalism, one premised on interconnectedness and tentacular, as in an octopus, tentacular thinking. Eileen Christ runs through the problems of the Anthropocene thinking, its resolute commitment to a unified human enterprise, as I like to say, could a more neoliberal turn of phrase be found? Elmar Altvater asks us to think about the geomanagerial and technocratic bias, the anti-political bias, really, of Anthropocene thinking and what it means that so many of their recommendations fall back on technical fixes bereft of any social transformation, geoengineering being only the most conspicuous. Justin McBrien has a fantastic essay where he points out quite correctly that the Capitalocene is also a necrocene, an age of death, and that becomes increasingly activated in the course of capitalist development, especially after 1945, that capitalism not only brings an era of mass extinction, as we know, we are living through the sixth mass extinction of life on Earth, but also implicitly, and this is my own riff, suggests that extinction is too polite a term, that we should be talking about capitalism as a system of mass extermination and especially of intergenerational mass murder. And so those are some of the big themes that come up. And did I leave anyone out? And Dan Hartley, who writes a brilliant essay asking us to think about culture and cultural fixes and the role of culture in capitalism and in capitalism as environment-making process. And that's hugely important because not just in Anthropocene thinking, but also on the left in terms of political economy thinking about environmentalism, about environmental change rather, there is a profound and I think unfortunate vulgar materialism in play that we have to take seriously Raymond Williams' arguments of ideas of nature, and that we've mixed our labor with the earth so much that we cannot draw back and separate the two out. That is a material and symbolic process at once. And if we think about that, that's fundamental to Marxist thinking about political economy and the separation of conception and execution in the labor process, but somehow that's been dropped from thinking about global environmental change. So we have to be wary of a vulgar materialism, which I fear often comes in through the back door.
So Jason and Christian, one notion that's come up a couple of times tonight is cheap nature and the four cheaps. What are the four cheaps, and how does the state contribute to keeping them cheap, or rise to the challenge of keeping them cheap?
Well,
and why is it important that they be cheap?
Let me try an alley-oop here. So four cheaps. The idea of capitalism as a system of cheap nature is essentially that every great wave of economic expansion of world accumulation must reset the cost of production for labor, food, energy, and raw materials. The four cheaps. And that means to increase the volume of those, simultaneously reducing the price of those. So agricultural revolutions are a key example of that. More and more food produced with less and less labor power. That's central. So in that process, however, capital is rather powerless in terms of its capacity to reset the costs of production. It requires the state.
Yeah, it is indistinguishable from the state, right? It is a state project in many ways, right? I mean, capital as a force of turning use values into exchange values emerges outside of the state within empires. I mean, you know, that kind of the cash nexus exists before capitalism, but it comes to dominate through the project of the emergence of the modern capitalist state. But in terms of the question of the four cheaps, I think this is a very important idea and very good, but maybe because I'm some sort of, I feel an obligation to sort of be a compulsive optimist because I'm ultimately very pessimistic. So there is this one cheap that I think I differ with Jason on, and it is the question of energy, because the four cheaps are, which you didn't name actually, right, which are cheap labor, cheap raw materials, cheap energy, and
Food.
Cheap food, right?
Yeah.
So energy is actually potentially infinite, right? This came to me reading Bataille's great book, The Accursed Share, Volume 1. I mean, Bataille is owned by the wrong side. All these cultural, sort of navel-gazing obscurantists love Bataille. But if you actually read The Accursed Share, it's, one, very Marxist, borderline Stalinist, I would say, on this chapter on the Soviet Union. And there's a kind of, beautiful materialism, and he opens with the discussion of the power of the sun, and you realize, this is like every day more energy hits the planet's surface than all of human civilization has used, right? So there's one cheap out there which is potentially infinite, and you could imagine, this is pitched at a very abstract level, you could imagine how the other cheaps, if their energy content grows and that energy is supplied by solar energy, could become cheaper, right? So you and others have written about the sort of the horizontal frontiers, the Americas, right? That's the original frontier that launches the development of capitalism. And then the vertical frontiers going into the ground for fossil fuels. But the vertical frontier might not be done, right? There's the other one going up or receiving what's coming down. That would only happen, obviously, if the state directed policy in that way, and the fundamental thing would have to be to confront the vested interests of the fossil fuel industry and use legal power to put them out of our misery. There is, I think, reason to, at the abstract level, not sort of politically, but just at the abstract level, to be hopeful, which is that even this society has the technology, it has the money, it even has the laws on the books to do this. And there is also actually this other frontier for capitalism, which is the infinite energy coming down from the sun. The problem is it is politically incapable of doing that, partly because the leading section of the leading ruling class globally, the American ruling class, is, as Doug Henwood says, a rotten social formation. And it's a rotten social formation because of its victories. It has won, it beat the left internationally, it beat the left domestically, and at that point, it fell apart because the ruling class is like any other class, right? Marx says the working class is a class in itself just because of its relationship to the means of production, but how does it become a class for itself? Through class struggle, right? Well, so too for the ruling class, right? They're a class in themselves because they own the means of production. Well, how do they become a class for themselves? How do they develop ruling class consciousness? How do they organize? How do they develop? How do they push their agenda? By being threatened, right? By having rebellions. And those are sometimes rebellions of nature. Disease has been a very important force in forming kind of rational factions within the ruling class that then plan. But mostly it's been political. It's been rebellions and it's been external enemies. And so victory has essentially let the herd develop mange and go to seed, and the wolves are gone. In that regard, the kind of the finance guys and the right wingers are right, but they have the agents wrong. It's like it's the left, it's the grassroots, it's the people who play the role of the wolves vis-a-vis the ruling class and keep that herd together. And once they're gone, the herd goes to seed. And so now you have Donald Trump. Now you have policies that don't serve the interests of capitalism in general. We don't have a healthcare policy that helps reproduce capitalism. We have a healthcare policy that serves the interests of the healthcare industry. We don't have an energy policy that will reproduce capital accumulation again and again on a global scale. We have an energy policy that serves the immediate interests of one industrial faction, the fossil fuel industry. And there's no coordinating authority within the class that seems capable of taking the state to steer us away from the cliff. Instead, we have one of these renegade factions, the fossil fuel faction, has dominated the GOP and has now got 3 branches of the government, and things look bad.
So it sounds as though our national state in the U.S. at least is turning into, and not only in the U.S., but is turning away from being an environment-making state to an environment-destroying state. Would you go that far?
No, I mean, if we're to use, to use, Jason's, if we're to follow Jason's urging of stepping away, taking this as a serious political project, that there are problems associated with continually dividing reality into society and nature, right? We can't do that. So no, it's always environment making, right? If Jim Hansen is correct and the Venus syndrome unfolds, that will be the product of human environment making. Yeah, I mean, and if you read environmental history, there is no moment where there isn't human environment making. Many of you, I'm sure, have read this sort of stuff, but for those who haven't, only in the last 20 years are we getting clear about the role of fire and human beings' use of fire to create whole landscapes. Here in the Northeast, Native Americans, all this romantic racism about they treaded lightly on land, that's all bullshit, right? They would burn the landscape twice a year. They turned the place into a game park by literally burning everything, So it wasn't like nature, the untouched preserve. It was produced by societies and through human society interaction. And part of what Jason's argument is that biophysical reality is just a series of organism-environment interactions, right? Every organism interacts with its environment, and every organism is part of the environment of some other organism. And all organisms are environment makers to some extent, and we just happen to be the most extreme and robust of those. Beavers need beaver dams. They don't find them, they make them. This goes on and on and on.
That's right. In hominin evolution itself